Well, good evening, everyone. Honored to be with you. My name is Jamin. I'm a pastor at a church called Mission Hills up in North San Diego County, not far from here. Those of you who know the area in San Marcos, or as everyone who lives in San Marcos calls it, San Marcos. About a half-hour drive down here today. About a year and a half ago, I had the honor of publishing a book I'd written with a friend of mine, Kyle, called The Way of the Dragon, The Way of the Lamb. And it's a book about power in the church. And one of the things that had kind of compelled Kyle and I to explore that theme for several years, and interviews and conversation and dialogue, and ultimately writing a book, was a great concern that the evangelical church, in particular in North America, had embraced a way of power that was antithetical to the gospel, but that wasn't being talked about. And power is a reality that touches on many issues in the life of the church, but I think the conference we're a part of here is certainly a part of that. And so, really honored to be a part of a conversation here around issues of abuse and assaults, and exploring questions together on issues of power in the life of the church. I think it's a conversation the church is desperate to have, and so I'm grateful we're having it. And come not as an expert on these topics, but really come as a pastor who seeks to learn from experts on these topics, and to think well about what it means to hold a position of authority and power in the life of a church, in light of, in particular, what's already been shared tonight by Mary and Rachel, and will be shared by others. And so it's my honor to be with you, and I do lean into this conversation together with other brothers in Christ who've willingly joined me in conversation as well, with a similar posture of wanting to be learners and wanting to process through ways in which we can think well as shepherds and leaders in congregations about these issues. And so Alex Junn, who's a ruling elder at New Life Presbyterian here on the end, and a professor at APU, if you could welcome him. And Tyler Johnson, who I suppose has traveled the farthest of all of us from Arizona, lead pastor at Redemption Church in Arizona. Would you welcome him with us? He brought some Redemption people with him in tow, which is awesome. You didn't bring them. They just showed up, yeah. And Nick Kinnier, who's a pastor at Saltworks Church up in Orange County, California. Would you welcome him? And so our hope this evening is really just a dialogue together as pastors, not to pretend to be experts in things we're not, but to dialogue about the questions that maybe have already been raised for us this evening as fellow ministry leaders and pastors, as many of you are in the room. How do we begin to wrestle with these questions, and how do we think well about them? How do we face the reality that abuse and assault are in our church, are attached to stories of lives of people in our church? How do we respond well to that? And so our hope is through kind of intentional dialogue here, we can help kind of cultivate conversation for those of you in the room who want to lean into this as well, who find themselves serving in maybe a myriad of ministry positions in the life of the church. And so I'll kick us off with kind of a first question to get our conversation started. And in recent years, cultural consciousness has really shifted significantly, in particular in North America, in regards to issues of sexual abuse and assaults. And in the last couple months, in fact, kind of high-profile stories and cases of Michael Jackson and R. Kelly have been thrust into our news feeds regularly. And the truth is that we as pastors and shepherds and leaders and folks who minister in the life of churches find ourselves in congregations full of people who are reading these news stories, full of people who are wrestling with questions around these stories and accounts that they're hearing. And so what I want to begin with, guys, is maybe a fundamental question. How might we as pastors help our congregations begin to think biblically about what they're already probably wrestling with as they see the news, as they process this information? How do we help them begin to think biblically about what they're seeing going on in our culture? Maybe, Tyler, you could start us off.
Yeah, I would just say, I think to start off, and Rachel spoke about this at the end, there's such a tendency in the church to constantly point fingers out there that you know that it's bad wherever it's not closest, it's bad out there. And I think the first thing I'd just say is there's clearly something happening in culture that I'd want people to see that is massively revealing. And all the time throughout history, I think God in His grace gives us opportunities for things to be revealed for the purposes of repentance. So there's a professor at the University of Trinidad who was speaking to justice issues, and he said the intercommunal antipathies, which means deep-seated dislikes that are present in the culture at large, are as present in the life of churches and their adherents. And I think that's what's so true here is as a pastor, it's so easy for people to look in the big bad world, so to point at an R. Kelly or to point at churches outside of that, but getting them to see that this is as present in us. And I'll just say this and then pass the mic. This was one of the things that was so striking to me engaging the book of Judges. When you come to Judges 19 and there's this horrific scene of a woman being preyed upon and abused, but the scene looks so much like Genesis. And in the book of Judges, it seems very obvious with what the author's trying to say is what you see that's so awful in the book of Genesis happening amongst whom you might call pagans is now happening in the people of God. And that scene ends with this woman being killed, the man seeing her killed, and he ends up dismembering her body and sending the body parts to the doorsteps of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it's this horrific scene, but I think in the end, God in His grace in this very weird way uses evil to show up at our doorsteps to, in His kindness, lead us to repentance.
I feel like the big disconnect for us in the church is we act as though nothing is going around outside of the church. I mean, it's the idea that spirituality of the church that we want to, and that's something that we embrace, right? We say, whatever's going on in the world, you come into the church and it's a safe place, and whatever's going on in the world won't harm you. The reality is, except for Sundays, the rest of our congregation is always out in the world and reading and digesting this information and bringing it in. I mean, it's almost like saying, if bad things happen, I want to be in the church, because we never talk about it in the church. It's almost like it doesn't exist. Right? And we know that's not true. And so Rachel's talk was really powerful, because you think about the leaders of the church who are supposed to be the representatives of justice and righteousness and truth don't address issues of righteousness and justice and truth. And so there's a disconnect in the members who see their pastors and their leaders week in and week out never acting as if there's nothing that goes on in the world. And I'm not so sure that being that countercultural is beneficial to people in the pews who are very much in the world and part of the culture.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, that the world, and culture and the consistent news cycle does a training on how to lament and deal with these things. And so when we don't have some way to address it in the church and recover, biblical lament, a way of experiencing God in the midst of pain, then our folks get formed outside the church. And I think, for me, especially as I reflect on my tradition, as Rachel was talking, we just didn't talk about stuff outside. And it's left, us so deficient, in able to, think about it, let alone just address this stuff outside or even in our midst. And so I think there's just such a call for a more holistic gospel that's integrated.
I think as I hear you guys talk, maybe the question that comes up for me that's a bit more pointed, maybe in particular for us or other elders in the room, pastors, ministry leaders in the room, is how does this impact the way in which we show up vocationally? As we think about shepherding, as we think about care, as we think about visitations and meeting people in our office, as we think about preaching and teaching, as we think about what's going on in small groups in life for a church, how does it begin to kind of settle into and forming and shaping some of those maybe more intentional vocational spaces where our leadership and what we say and how we show up in a space shapes and informs what is believed in our space.
Yeah, I would just start by saying I think we have to grow in the Scripture's admonition to be quick to listen and slow to speak. And I don't think in the ministerial vocation that most of us have been shaped or trained in that. We've all been trained to speak. That's like the massive part of our training. And yet one of the greatest agents of love and care is your ears and the ability to be quick to listen and slow to speak. I know Francis Schaeffer had a line that if he had spent 60 minutes with somebody, he'd spend 55 minutes of it listening and 5 minutes of it talking. And as I've reflected upon that, I've thought to myself, one of the things that's so incredible about that statement is the 55 minutes listening is so healing, and that it actually makes you far wiser in what you articulate, because you're actually hearing what somebody's saying. But I think we just need to really practice the discipline of listening and then cultivating environments of listening, and really advising one another to shut our mouths, so that we can, I don't know if many of us are good at empathy, actually feeling with someone, because we've never trained ourselves to actually listen or look at someone. And it seems in the life of Jesus that he sees and hears people, and that's what affects his guts to be moved at such a level to even determine what to do. And I think our temptation in this is going to be to figure out what to do before we sit and get to the point where we see and hear long enough to actually feel it.
I'm thinking about the difference between innocence and naivete. And I think oftentimes we long for innocence, but we're actually mistaking that for being naive. And if we heard the statistics and it rocks you, we realize we can no longer be naive. William Wilberforce famously said, you can choose to look the other way, but you can no longer say you didn't know. And now we all know. And what do we do in our vocation? What is our work? What is our responsibilities? And I think of in my faith tradition, the role, the threefold office of a shepherd, right? Priest and prophet and king. It's the kingly piece that I think we need to put more focus on. We can preach and we can minister, but it's the kingly piece. It's how are you ruling well? How are you executing some of the responsibilities and taking care of the people within your sphere of influence? And I think we don't do that as well, and perhaps we don't see it because we assume, oh, this is what the world is doing. It's actually quite a slap in the face to the church if the world seems to respond better and more appropriately toward justice than we do. And they don't have the right reason to do it. We do. So it's, today's talk was just a huge conviction for me as a leader. And that's something that I think we need to sit in for a while and realize we need to take action. And the easiest thing to do is to listen and feel badly and then hope it doesn't happen at our church. It's almost impossible if those statistics are true. Can't hope that it doesn't happen in my church. It probably already has. And I don't know it. So it's one of those things that you realize your feet stink and nobody told you, and then you come to these things and it's publicly expressed, and now I've got to sit here in this little fishbowl here, and I'm like, yeah, my church has not done a very good job of this, and everyone else knew it. So how do I then, as a member of my session, as a member of the elder board, how do I respond? I think it's with great humility and this conviction of wanting to confess that I have failed my members by not caring enough about this, by being naive as opposed to being innocent.
Yeah, I was thinking about Richard Hayes. He wrote this article on sexuality, and towards the end he says, I'm afraid that we've gotten the accents in the wrong place when it comes to sexuality, and I think that what's come off very clear and loud, as a pastor, is kind of the biblical black and white, the prohibitions around sexuality, but we've neglected care and seeing sexuality as something that the Spirit wants to unpack with people, rather than seeing it as this, blanket, right or wrong thing, something that's easily contaminated. And so I think that we have some work to do to see sexuality as a very normative place where the Spirit does his best work, and he's not, the Spirit is showing up, with loads of care, not kind of demanding compliance. And that's just what we've been really loud at for many, many years. And so I think that just shapes,
Can I build on that? I was thinking about, somebody was telling me a story about how kids are naturally not afraid of water, but it's a learned behavior because a little toddler gets close to the water and the parents freak out. So the kid associates the water with danger and fear, and they see it in the kid's eyes. I think that's where we are with sex. Sex is good. Sex is, God has given this to us as a gift, but we associated it with something and only something that's negative. Like, don't get in trouble, don't do this and don't do that. So the association with sex, instead of being something that's a gift that the Lord has given to us within certain confines, of course, we have taken it and made it ugly and dirty and shameful. And so, we don't talk about those things. And I think that's part of the problem is we haven't taken a positive approach of what it is for.
Yeah, I think what strikes me as you guys talk, and I share in your sense of conviction, Alex, and even in hearing the two women who we were privileged to hear this evening speak, the same thought came to my mind, which is my lack of awareness that this has happened in my church certainly doesn't rule out the large possibility that it has, and what it means to be more intentional and cognizant. And the phrase that was coming to mind as I was hearing all three of you talk was this call to shepherd in reality. And that can be really uncomfortable and difficult. But I think that's the charge. And as I think about the pieces of the pastoral office that are most fundamental to the vocation, much of which for me has been learned from a dear mentor who's recently left us, Eugene Peterson, but that prayer and preaching and presence, these things are proper to the pastoral office. And I think what surfaces for me is questions of how I'm praying for my congregation and what I'm praying about. And what really struck me this evening is, confess to you all, I pray for my church quite a bit. I pray for specific people in the life of my church. I pray for my congregation generally. But this has not been something I pray about. And if there are cases in which I am aware of it, then it has been brought to my attention, whether through pastoral care and counseling. But beyond that, it's not something that's on my radar screen when I think about how to pray for my church. And when I think about the statistics that were offered to us earlier, the number of people in my congregation who this is part of their story, there's a call to pray for them in that regard, whether I know it or not. I think about preaching, and I think about preaching in reality of what's actually sitting in the pew, the chairs in my church. Preaching with a recognition that when I talk about certain topics and themes, that this can really trigger certain things in the room that it wouldn't trigger for me, and that I might not imagine it triggers, but it probably is. Thinking about how I show up in a room for pastoral care and counseling, and the very subtle decisions perhaps I make or we make of making eye contact or not making eye contact when someone shares something uncomfortable with me, that may be an invitation to go a step deeper in providing real sense of healing presence where someone's deeply shamed, but could cause them to recoil because it looks as though I'm kind of recoiling from where I think this might be headed. I don't know if other pastors or elders in the room, ministry leaders, can resonate with this, but this is what's coming up for me, is the work I need to do to shepherd in reality and to pray for my congregation in light of what we're talking about, and to preach in view with eyes for those in the room that are experiencing this, and to show up in a room mindful of the fact that this may very well be a part of this person's story, whether we ever get there or not. And I think the last piece of that is really getting really alliteration heavy here: prayer, preaching, presence. Oh, goodness. I must be a pastor. But the fourth one is protection, right? That's what was coming to mind, that we're called to actually protect and guard the flock. And that church discipline is actually critical in this regard. Systems of accountability. Not long ago in the life of our church, we had some questions by other staff about why it's so difficult for people to serve in their ministry, and all the background checks forms and the long process and the procedures. And my simple response is, I want to make it really hard for people to get near our kids, like really hard. And if they're put off by that, that's probably a warning sign to us. Like if they're bothered by having to do a background check form, or they're bothered by having to wait, or they're bothered by having to be around longer, or they're bothered by having to get to know us more, or go through a process of membership, then that probably is a sign. But that there's a real call to put in place systems and structures that embrace this reality. Like there are people who are dangerous who are showing up to our church. And we may not see them that way, but they are. And so as I hear you guys talk, those are some things that come up for me, is the pieces of our vocation that are central, prayer and preaching and presence and protection, that moving into those with this reality in our hands. This kind of moves us maybe a bit more focused into questions about how this has shown up in the life of the church. And the stories that I've mentioned to start us with of R. Kelly and Michael Jackson are not stories inside of the church, but recent news has not been short on those stories as well. Think about the report recently issued about what's happened in the Southern Baptist Convention and many churches connected. I think of the recent fall of Bill Hybels and the numerous accounts of abuse and assault by women who worked with him or members of the church. And so maybe where I want to kind of move us, gentlemen, is to ponder this together. How do we as pastors respond to those realities? When our congregation is aware that the church is failing, maybe not our specific church is attached to those stories, but they know the church more broadly has failed. The church is caught up in this. How do we respond well to that, to these grievous stories? How can we create an environment in our church that begins to perhaps respond intentionally and show our congregation we're responding intentionally to perhaps the concerns that they have around those issues? Maybe, Tyler, you could start us off.
Yeah, as you were just talking, Jamin, I had the thought of when David's praying, "Search me and know me, God, and show if there's any offensive or sinful way within me." When you were speaking about praying, I thought this is something we should be doing as leaders of the church, is to pray a corporate prayer on behalf of our congregations. Lord, search us and know us. Show if there's any sinful way within us. That's one specific thought of seeking God in that. And then I think we do have to begin to figure out ways, and there's experts here to help us do this, of how we create listening sessions to allow people to expose that. But again, Rachel mentioned this, and I think the more we understand the nature of sin and this reality that there's no one we can dupe like we can dupe ourselves, is that one of the ways in which we prevent that is we want it to still stay out there. So, as long it was out there in the culture, and now it's the Catholic Church, but that's the Catholics, and then Rachel tells us the truth about the statistics, that it's Protestant churches, but it's those Protestant churches, and it's not our church. But what would it look like to actually intentionally, as we're praying that prayer to God, open up listening sessions? And I'll just end by saying this. In Acts 6, when there's this problem of justice with the Hellenist widows and the Hebrew widows, somehow we have to go, some way that happened, that in the early church, the Hebrew widows were being cared for, the Hellenists were not. But the way they solved it was to appoint 7 leaders of good character and repute, all of which were Hellenists. So at some point in this, I do think there's a reality, and I'll just speak specifically of women, to begin to say we have to create listening sessions where we don't just listen, but we give them the ability to help us fix the situation, rather than us being the ones who fix it, that are in fact the ones who allowed it to happen on our watches.
Yeah. That's so good.
I think we can talk about policies and procedures, and those are important, but the piece that is missing is consciousness and awareness for, let's be honest, if we're talking about pastors, and this is, I'm not trying to have a theological debate here, but most of the pastors are men, and most of the leaders at churches are men. And so our maleness often supersedes some of our responsibilities as leaders. And so the way we interpret and hear information is going to be as men. I think we need to say that and acknowledge that that is a reality. Because if we don't do that, in our role, we fail to recognize that we are already truncated or blind in many respects. And so we can't hear. It's just the nature, and most of the work that I do is on justice and equity along race. And so it's the same idea. If you're in the non-dominant group, have a complaint that you're going to share with the leadership, and you're in the dominant group, you just can't hear it. It's hard. So if you're men, it's just hard to understand. I think part of the challenge, too, is the way that we understand the word sex is problematic, right? I'm at a Christian institution, and we have regular occurrences of assault on campus. This is not just my campus, it's most Christian colleges. People were drinking, and it was consensual to a certain point, and then it wasn't, and so they report it. And of course, the Christian response is, you guys were drinking? What were you doing alone? You know, all these other things that sort of emerging, and we lose the focus of what we're really talking about. Even the term sexual assault is problematic, because the way we understand sex in a good way, right? It has actually probably the actions and all that has nothing to do with sex. It's violence and it's rape, and we need to change the language, but we assume that it was consensual because we use the same word, right? I think it was Jackson Katz gave the example, if I hit you over the head with a pan, is that cooking? Does it have anything to do with what that was intended for? No. So why do we associate this with sex? So, I mean, even the way we approach it is problematic, right? And so I'm starting to try to deconstruct that in my own mind. And it's hard because my natural maleness views a world a certain way, and it's hard for me to hear. And I think I need to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think as I was reflecting on this, and you hear these, just horror stories of what happens, and and I'm probably speaking for myself, but you kind of want a distance, and you want to say it's out there, and I think that is, it doesn't do justice to the cross, and it doesn't do justice to the reality that Jesus is building his church, and so that, I think, empowers us to, we should be leading the charge in kind of that self-examination, we saw it out there, let's dig in here. Because Christ has given us that freedom. And yet, so often we just mirror the protective, reflex that we see mirrored in culture. I just think that there is some, institutional idolatry that goes on here that at the end of the day, Christ and his work and the way in which he has covered things gives us the freedom to look at really hard things in our midst.
Yeah, as I hear you guys talk, I think what comes up for me is this real temptation that I know I have faced as well in ministry under different circumstances, but that I think is really corresponding. This thread I hear often in response to what's being exposed in the church, which is kind of an ignoring or a brushing aside or a diminishing for the greater good, right? The protection of the church, or framing oftentimes in more ministerial terms for the sake of the ministry. And I think what I hear in all three of you that I would really want to affirm and echo is we are doing no good when we do that. That honesty, self-reflection, and repentance, these are ingredients to what it means to shepherd and lead well. And I think the grave temptation often is to, you mentioned it, Tyler, to view the problem as out there, but oftentimes it's to view the problem as out there in those other churches, the churches that really went awry, the churches that really messed up, where the case was really bad, or where the institution really failed in ways we could never imagine we would. And in doing so, we fail to embrace, I think, the invitation of the Lord to us, which is to search our hearts, right? And to see where we have gone wayward, and to pay attention to our own failures and to repent. And I think so often grievously. We are willing to really link arms with other churches out there as kind of a shared sense properly of the Catholicity of the church and the body of Christ when those churches are really doing good things. But we really shirk away from doing so when the church has failed. And we need to be willing to stand with the church in its failure in repentance, even if it didn't happen at our property, at our facility. And that's what I hear in the three of you, is a real call to own the truth and to reflect in honesty and to repent, and not view the problem as just out there. Maybe to push us even more into this a bit, I think these stories of sexual abuse, sexual misconduct, sexual assaults that have surfaced in the life of the church often are very tethered to power dynamics in the life of the church and authority structures and the way in which leadership is wielded and leveraged. And Alex, maybe you could start us here, but thinking well about the power dynamics in the life of the church that come to bear on this issue that we need to be mindful of and thoughtful of as leaders.
Yeah. You know, I don't even think this discussion has to do with sexual assault and reporting in the church. When we talk about power, we can take any issue. And I'm trying to reflect here as a leader. If somebody has a complaint at church and they're going to share with an elder or a pastor, the immediate response is don't complain. We sort of want to protect ourselves. If somebody makes a comment about it's anger or it's pride or it's bullying and all these types of things, it's not sexual assault, but this is going on in the church. Our response is typically to wield our power. And I need to, again, recognize if you're a leader, the church, I have tremendous power as a member of my session, a member of my elder board. And for my inability to respond or even understand what the concerns are, my first response is protect my friends. My first response is to protect the pastor that I love, whom I'm spending so much time with. It's natural to want to be defensive. And I think it starts with that. It's not even sexual assault. It's every topic that comes up. It's really hard to prosecute my friend or to agree. So you're already at a disadvantage if you're a member and you're not in the inner circle of the leadership. And I think I need to recognize that not everybody's voices are equal. And that's a problem with the leadership because we've embraced the power and it is almost impossible to break through. It has to be an egregious error because I realize the little things. I mean, somebody had a comment about a pastor preached last week and, my immediate response was, how do I get rid of this problem so it doesn't affect my pastor or it doesn't affect, because I'm not going to tell him. That's going to be, that's just a nuisance. I mean, that kind of mentality, I think, is problematic for me and problematic for leaders. So I think we need to recognize that it's not just sex, it's all topics that people in positions of power, we naturally want to, it's self-preservation. And that's the culture. I know Boz Division is here. I'm on a missions board for my denomination. We asked Boz and his group, Grace, to come in and do an assessment of our culture at the missions organization. And that's what it was. There was no one specific incident, some egregious error that led to this investigation. It was, we need an assessment. And so I think that's a step in the right direction, but it had everything to do with the leadership, people in positions of power who struggle with self-awareness. And that's probably the hardest thing for leaders.
Yeah, I think there's a huge tipping of the hat to sin rather than a deep understanding of what it is in particular. So I think that's a huge part of the power dynamic, is this defensiveness nature. So when Paul talks about putting on the new self in Colossians, depending upon your translation, but one of the words is meekness, and one of the best definitions I've heard of that, or illustrations of that, was the difference in boxing between a power bag and a speed bag. So when you hit a speed bag, it pops right back at you, and that's the majority. When you're trying to defend yourself and push towards selfish ambition, which James 3 says don't do, when somebody attacks you, you go right back like a speed bag, where meekness is actually like a power bag. in boxing, the big bags that when you hit them, they just kind of envelop the punch, which should be when we understand sin. And I know many people in this room, not all, would say they're part of the Reformed tradition. One of my favorite doctrines of the Reformation is the Reformed and always reforming according to the Word of God, because it's one of the most humble doctrines to say, we know we're in the wrong right now. So therefore, we're constant. That's the definition of sanctification. So that's one thing. And then the other one I'd just say is our view of power has been we've so much capitulated to the world. It's astounding the more you look at Jesus's life and his path to power as a downward path that will only find our resurrection in our death, which he speaks about all the time. So this getting low, this reality of humility, that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. I just think we need to spend way more time reflecting upon that when it comes to the building of what we'd call institutional strength, or the reality of the positions of the leaders in the church, to model the path of humility and fighting for obscurity that wouldn't be surprised when sin is diagnosed within our own hearts and in our own congregations.
Yeah, that's really good.
I think that I think that power, because we haven't thought about it, has created just this fertile soil where any number of things grow. And I think that what kind of, I was just thinking culturally, like on, my church staff, thinking through not just what gets done, but how it gets done. And that how it gets done, how leadership gets implemented, how authority is viewed, that will say something to the congregation, and it has the potential to put a different power and the gospel on display. So I don't know, I just feel, as you were just saying that, I just feel really challenged that, like, just even interpersonally, we have decision after decision after decision of choosing which kind of power we're going to use. And I think so often we just resort to a pragmatism that is just destructive and doesn't create the kind of culture where things, like abuse can actually find the right channels and be dealt with.
Yeah, I think as you were talking, Tyler, about James 3 and his concern there about selfish ambition and jealousy, and naming that as the way from below. And it brings me back to an interaction I had several years ago with Marva Dawn. If any of you know Marva Dawn, a wonderful writer and teacher in the Lord. And I remember in conversation with Marva, her talking about that with me, selfish ambition and jealousy. And she said, you know where you can find that? Where can you find that? Just go to a pastor's conference, and that's all you'll see. And I remember, being a pastor and being put a bit on my heels in that, and thinking to myself in that conversation, I know that's unfortunate, and I know it's not the way that pastors ought to lead, and ought not be the way they relate to one another, and kind of competition, and using their churches as platforms for or for fortune and for fame, and using people in their church to achieve their dreams and vision rather than actually shepherding them. But boy, that's just kind of endemic in evangelicalism. So, like, what do we do about that? And I remember all of that is kind of rolling through my mind when she said to me, and you know what I've thought when I've seen that at pastors' conferences, Jamin? What's that? That's demonic. Yeah. That really put me on my heels. But she's right. And what Marva was getting at is actually what James says in James 3, that there's a way of power that is antithetical to the gospel that I think in many ways the church in North America has embraced. a way of power and strength for the sake of control, where the ends justify the means, where personalities get leveraged to accomplish things, where the force of a human's vision is what can unite us, not Christ, where people get used to achieve ministry ends rather than shepherded, where little things like prayer and care, the little work of ministry gets delegated to the unimportant people on staff so the pastor can do the big important things. These are all subtle ways in which a kind of power has been embraced in the life of the church that is antithetical to the cross and antithetical to the way of Jesus. This power and strength for the sake of control is not the way of Jesus. It's power and weakness for the sake of love. And I think so much of what we've seen in the life of the church in recent years, certainly we have to talk about sexual sin and individual sexual sin. And that's a part of it. But so often these stories are about power. And the same narcissism and lust and greed that is the downfall of some pastors is the same narcissism, lust, and greed that made them, quote unquote, great leaders before that. And we need to acknowledge as a church that we have, in many ways and in many times, been inclined towards toxic leaders who are in fact dangerous because they can get things done and make them happen. And we like being a part of that. And I think that power is something we have to reckon with as a church, because if Marva's right that it's not just a matter of individual sin or misguided leadership style, but a way in which the devil has found his way into the household of God, then we have much work to do here. The last question I'll leave us with here, because I'm like 4 minutes over time, but I think we can still do it, is a question in regards to something that's already been surfaced by several guys here. I'd like to keep talking about it as we finish. It is moving us into this question of sexual ethics more broadly. And not to speak as experts in regards to what has already been spoken of tonight, but maybe for us to speak, as we close here, brothers, pastorally, about the ways in which our sexual ethic in the church has perhaps not done us favors in providing environments of safety and honesty and care in regards to the issue at hand here. The ways in which we have or have not talked about sex, the ways in which we have articulated a sexual ethic. Maybe, Nick, you could start us off here, actually.
Yeah, as I was listening to Rachel and Mary, the profound shame and guilt that gets buried in our sexuality is staggering, and I grew up in the purity culture, right? In the 80s and 90s, and I was just wondering how abuse survivors hear kind of all of these prohibitions. Sexuality is something that you have to keep pure. What happens when it's not? And I go, wow, I think that we didn't, in focusing so much on protecting, which of course is right, but in focusing so heavily on that, I think we missed maybe the Spirit's invitation, to bring healing and care in the midst of sexuality. And so I think going forward, I think we just, generally speaking, we have to think differently about sex beyond the prohibitions. We have to articulate what it's for. And I think we just need to know that there is hope. I love Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4. I mean, he just says, no, it is God's will that you'd be sanctified. And he starts with sexuality, with the Thessalonians. And I think God is just not afraid of it. So I think there's obviously been some very destructive things that have got us to this point, but I think that there is deep hope in the area of sexuality. I think that's where we can learn discipleship.
My final thoughts are that we need to change the narrative. I feel like I've been fed a steady diet, both in the world and in the church, of this narrative. It's not even toxic masculinity, it's the glamorized masculinity. You think about Snow White and Cinderella and or Sleeping Beauty, right? The idea that an unconscious young girl asleep and a stranger comes along and sees her as beautiful and kisses her without her consent. And if she's supposed to then respond and say, wow, this is the love of I fell in love with this person, this perfect stranger. I've never questioned that story growing up. I was told that story at bedtime. I think we all were. And then I go to church and then I hear the story of David and Bathsheba and lots of examples. And did Bathsheba have a choice when the king calls you, summons you? That abuse of power. Another word for that is rape. And do we frame it that way or not? She's just a minor character and it's all about David and what happened to David. I mean, I get why we would do that, but then we extend that to these scandals that happen in our churches, and we focus on the men, the pastors, the leaders, not about the victims. We said, we don't want this to happen to us. And we're talking about the men who fall from leadership. We don't talk about the women who were victimized. So we got to change the narrative.
I enjoy panels because you get to kind of build on each other. It's not but one thing I'll say is I really think we need to ask the question that if the enemy is attacking that which is good, kind of a leech sucking the blood, or the life, as Leviticus says, life's found in the blood, sucking it out of the good creation of God, why is he so after sexuality all the time? And I would just submit that I think we need to spend more time around the way in which the gospel's spoken of in this groom-bride language, and that the ultimate event of the consummation, that in the end, I think sex is not just the good gift of procreation. It's not just the good gift of being highly enjoyable, but it is those things, because maybe one of the greatest gospel tracts that God has given the world is human sexuality. And if we looked at it as that, most of the time when this modern last decade of we need to recover the goodness of sex, it's just like, how frank can the church talk about sex in ways that sounds like the world, rather than sacredly speak about it in ways that kind of are honestly mind-blowing in the midst of it. So that's just an added element to that.
Well, as our time draws to a close here, I'm not inclined to add anything to what these three men have said here in the close, but maybe a passage that was, as I was praying about our evening together and praying about today and tomorrow, a passage that came to mind for me to close us with, to close our panel with, is from Galatians 6. So I'll read that and we'll close. Galatians 6, beginning in verse 6. Let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary of doing good. For in due season we will reap if we do not give up. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. Thank you for letting us join you tonight and start the dialogue. Bless you.